It was December 24th, 1885, and the city of Austin, Texas was in a panic. Two women had been found murdered in their yards, their bodies bearing grisly wounds. They were the seventh and eighth victims of a madman, a killer who had begun their killing spree the year before. The murderer would commit their grisly crimes and then seemingly just disappear into the night, only to reappear later and further terrorize the city. When a mere 3 years later the city of London, England was terrorized by a series of murders, newspapers in Texas speculated that the Austin murderer, who had been dubbed the Servant Girl Annihilator or the Intangible Menace by the American press, might have migrated to the old world to become Jack the Ripper. The murderer in Austin is thought to be among the first serial killers in the United States. It is history that shouldn't be forgotten. Prior to 1884, the future of Austin had been looking bright. The city was the new capital of what, prior to that time, had been the Republic of Texas. In 1838, the capital had been moved from Houston to Austin. The new location was chosen because it was further west, which was considered the future, and also because of its natural beauty. The sunsets were said to be so vivid in Austin that it was called the City of the Violet Crown, for the way the light reflected off the hills. Cotton and cattle created an economic boom in Texas, and Austin saw an influx of residents and businesses in the late 1800s. Between 1860 to 1880, U.S. Census records show that the population of Austin grew from around 3,500 people to more than 11,000. The city boasted a university, numerous shops, churches, and a luxury hotel where every room had its own indoor toilet. Near the town limits, there was a state-of-the-art asylum called the Texas State Lunatic Asylum. At the facility, the troubled residents of Austin were cared for by the director, Dr. James Given. He practiced the latest ideas in the care of patients by building paths that curved instead of running straight, because it was believed to be more soothing to the mind. He also tore down the high fence surrounding the property and built a simple low enclosure, because he didn't want the patients to feel trapped. The jewel in Austin's crown was the construction of a new state capitol building, with its cornerstone placed March 2nd, 1885. When construction was completed 3 years later, the government leadership of Texas declared the building was the seventh largest building in the world. Some historians estimate that it is more than 30 feet taller than the United States Capitol building and larger than the English Parliament buildings were at the time. This booming growth and development made everyone believe Austin's best times were on its way, which made what happened next all the more surprising. Tom Chalmers was visiting his brother-in-law in Austin when he was awakened during the night of December 31st, 1884, by someone calling for help and knocking on the front door. Walter Spencer, the boyfriend of Molly Smith, who was a servant for the household, had blood streaming down his face. He said he'd been attacked in the servants' quarters in the backyard and needed help. Walter said he didn't know what had happened to Molly, but they had been attacked by a shadowy man. Chalmers thought Spencer was either drunk or exaggerating and told him to go find a doctor and shut the door. Spencer, a black servant, knew better than to argue with a white man. He went to a doctor and had his wound treated and then went home. In the morning, the body of Molly Smith, covered in blood, was found in the alley. Her room in the service quarters was a rack. In the corner was a blood-covered axe. A blood-stained handprint was near the door. Unfortunately, it would be years before forensic science would make use of fingerprints, originally called finger marks, to identify suspects of crimes. Bloodhounds were brought to the scene, where they sniffed the evidence and milled about, seemingly confused by the copious amounts of blood. They were unable to find a trail to follow. Everything about this murder was confusing to the authorities, who came to investigate. First of all, there seemed to be no clear motive. Usually crimes committed in Austin were crimes of passion or opportunity. This was something else. The police first examined Walter Spencer, Molly's boyfriend, who was known around town as a conscientious and careful laborer. Molly's friends said their relationship was a happy one. They didn't believe he would have killed her. A previous boyfriend was arrested for suspicion of murder, but he was released when his alibi checked out. The manner of wounds on Molly's body was shocking. Domestic violence and drunken brawls weren't unknown in Austin. In fact, when Elizabeth Custer, wife of George Armstrong Custer, saw Austin, she wrote to a friend, "Jayhawkers, bandits, and bushwhackers had everything their own way. The lawlessness was terrible." But Molly's murder was gruesome. The investigation led nowhere, and servants across the city began to sleep at the houses of their employers or friends. Nothing else happened for a time, and everyone calmed down as Austin moved into the new year. But then, in March, servant girls across the city began to be harassed at night. Rocks were thrown at windows. In a few instances, someone shot a pistol through a wall. A German immigrant told authorities she was grabbed in the darkness by a man and told, "Your money or your life." Her assailant hit her in the head with something sharp. She screamed and was able to escape. Then, a cook was awakened from a deep sleep by her doorknob being shaken violently. She said she looked out the window, but no one was visible. Down the street, 2 young black servants were awakened by the same thing. Someone was trying to get in the door. One of them opened the door to see what was going on and said she was grabbed from behind. She screamed, alerting her employer, a man who had fought in the Civil War for the Confederacy. He came running out with his gun, and the attacker vanished. These strange nightly attacks and harassment continued. But then, on March 19, 1885, Clara Strand and Christine Martinson, 2 servant girls from Sweden, were attacked and seriously hurt. Like the others, they were assaulted in the night, and then their assailant shot through the window of their home and hit one of the girls in the spine. At this point, servant girls across Austin were packing up and heading somewhere else. Racial tensions in the city became evident as the white citizens blamed black men for the attacks. One Austinite wrote a letter to the editor that said, "And if one of the scoundrels who has been out shooting and scaring our servant girls can be caught, let him be strung up on a limb or lamppost without mercy or delay." William Sidney Porter, an Austin resident who would go on to become the famed American author with the pen name O. Henry, wrote to a friend that Austin was fearfully dull, except for the frequent raids of the Servant Girl Annihilators, who make things lively during the dead hours of the night. The black residents of Austin, who were mainly the victims of the attacks, pushed back with the belief that they were being targeted by a deranged white man. They slept with furniture blocking the doors and windows so that the madman couldn't get in. They also crafted charms and necklaces to avoid the killer's evil eye. When Eliza Shelley was murdered on May 6th, her body was found next to the bed where her children had slept with her. One of Eliza's sons told police that he had been awakened in the night by a man who told him to go back to sleep. He told police his mother had been killed by a black man, but other witnesses to the killings would disagree with that testimony, saying the man was white. The killing spree continued later in May of that same year when Irene Cross, a black cook, was found in her backyard, severely injured. She was still alive for hours after the attack, and the authorities desperately asked her, "Who did this to you?" Unable to answer because of her injuries, Irene died of her wounds. City authorities admitted their inability to solve these perplexing crimes and hired detectives, first from the Noble Detective Agency of Houston, and then the Pinkerton and Company United States Detective Agency of Chicago, but neither agency made headway in the case. The New York Times reported that nearly every man in the city, black or white, known to have idiosyncrasies of any kind, had been watched by the detectives. More than 400 suspects, mostly black men, were arrested, some, according to the New York Times article, subjected to very severe examinations, but none could be proven to be the killer. Tensions increased in Austin when Mary Ramey, Gracie Vance, and Orange Washington were killed in August and September. Mary Ramey had been only 11 years old, and with her mother, when the killer struck. Similar to the first murder of Molly Smith, most of the women were severely injured, or had sharp objects inserted into their ears or skulls, and most of the women who had been attacked were black. One of the biggest clues to the killer's identity was a strange footprint which had been left near the scene of some of the crimes. The murderer changed tactics on Christmas Eve that year when he murdered 2 white women, Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, within a few hours of each other. Men started staying awake all night with guns in their hands in an effort to protect their family. Austin hired a dozen more police officers who patrolled the streets at night. Businesses led a booming trade in window locks and other primitive security systems, while medicine shops sold tonics to calm the hysterical women of Austin. The story made national paper headlines. The New York World's headline read, "Those extraordinary and similar assassinations of women at Austin. Facts as marvelous as the most extravagant fiction." The reporter labeled the killer the Intangible Nemesis. He wrote, "I do not believe any man figures in the world's history with such a terrible and horrifying distinction from the rest of humanity. He may well give history a new story of crime. The first instance of a man who killed in order to gratify his passion." Eula Phillips and Susan Hancock's husbands were both arrested on suspicion of murder. Moses Hancock was found not guilty. But the trial of Eula Phillips' husband, James Phillips, was more of a scandal. Eula Phillips had been considered one of the most beautiful women in Austin. A witness who ran an establishment that catered to quick liaisons testified that Eula was meeting men at her business and actually appeared there mere hours before she was found murdered. This revelation affected the careers of some prominent Austin politicians when the witness said some of the men Eula had been meeting were from the Austin City Clerk's office. In addition to Eula's infidelity, James Phillips was portrayed as an abusive drunk who forced his wife to find happiness in the arms of others. Phillips' attorneys fought back, saying that none of this character assassination proved that James Phillips had killed his wife. There was no evidence to tie Phillips to the crime. The lawyers even had Phillips lay his foot over a replica of the killer's footprint that had been found at the scene. Phillips' foot was much smaller. In a shocking pronouncement, the jury found James Phillips guilty. The sentence was overturned by a judge who ordered a new trial, and after that the case against him was dropped by the state. And, as quickly as they'd begun, the murders simply stopped. No one was ever held accountable for the crimes. In 1888, when Jack the Ripper began killing in London, the papers in Texas began drawing connecting lines between the crimes committed in Austin and what was happening in the largest city on Earth. Scholars who have since studied the Servant Girl Annihilator case have posited several theories over who the killer might have been. In his book The Midnight Assassin, author Skip Hollandsworth speculates that the murderer might have been the son-in-law of Dr. James Given, who was the man who ran the Texas Lunatic Asylum, because the murder stopped shortly after Given had his son-in-law involuntarily committed. Or it might have been a mysterious Malaysian cook who worked near the scene of some of the murders and who in 1885 had abruptly told his employers that he was planning to relocate to London. In her 2003 book, Jack the Ripper, The American Connection, author Shirley Harrison suggests that James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant that some suspect might have been Jack the Ripper, and the purported author of a journal confessing to the Jack the Ripper killings, often traveled to the American South and could have been visiting Austin during the time of the Austin killings, thus making him capable of being both Jack the Ripper and the Servant Girl Annihilator. History Detectives, a television show on PBS, put forth the theory that the killer might have been an Austin cook named Nathan Elgin. Elgin was said to have a club foot with a missing toe. That might explain the strange footprints that were found near some of the crimes, and the murder seemed to stop shortly after Elgin was shot to death by deputies while committing an assault. 3 years later, when the murders started in London, they captivated the world, and the murders in Austin seemed to fade from memory as they were overshadowed by the legend of Jack the Ripper. Because of the London murders, many modern methods of criminal investigation were pioneered, and that has led some to claim that Jack the Ripper was the first modern-day serial killer. But those methods didn't seem to make the most important difference because, of course, the two have something very much in common. The killer was never positively identified. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.